so much all for coming to today's Haddin Forum. Those of you who are used to seeing Dr. Quinlan introduced, he is in Dublin doing research on Seamus Heaney. So I am going to be introducing Brian Steele, and obviously you know why you're here, to see Dr. Brian Steele, who is an associate professor of history at UAB. Last year, Cambridge University Press published his book, Thomas Jefferson and American Nationhood. That book was recently named a notable title in American intellectual history by the Society for U.S. Intellectual History. It has also been named a finalist for the Starr Center's $50,000 2013 George Washington Book Prize. The jury will announce the winner on May 22nd, and I think we should all keep our fingers crossed for that. Brian has won UAB's Frederick W. Connor Prize in the History of Ideas twice, and in 2010, Brian received a Dean's Award for excellence in teaching in the College of Arts and Sciences. I think we're in for a treat today.
So if you win the award, are you having a party?
If I win the award, yeah, my credit card company is going to have a party. Of course, I don't think they're usually happy about you paying things off, right?
No.
So, okay, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you all very much for being here. It's a real treat for me to get to come and talk a little bit about Jefferson with you. I should say at the beginning, too, that I understood that the purpose of this forum is to kind of discuss some preliminary ideas about sort of future research. So everything I say is, is preliminary and somewhat conjectural. So that gets me out of any difficult questions that you may ask me later, and which I'm excited to entertain, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas about these issues. Jefferson, I want to say a couple of things just briefly about him first, and this is related to what I've already written about him, and it connects in interesting ways, I think, with some of these things I want to talk about Jefferson and religion, which I kind of left on the editing floor in the process of writing the book. But Jefferson, one scholar said, was incapable of boredom, and which I think is one reason that he remains endlessly fascinating to scholars and the general public alike. But there is a historical Jefferson bound in time and place, and that's the Jefferson that historians try to work to recover, sort of trying to protect the story from distortion and trying to understand him and his context. But there's also a Jefferson who's deeply embedded in American cultural memory and collective consciousness. And we Americans, I find it interesting, have generally tried to justify nearly everything we've done in the world, if we're going to speak in explicit terms about why we're doing something, in words that he left us. And I find it truly fascinating that Americans have continued to try to live up to, in some way or another, those aspirations. The trick, of course, is that what those aspirations mean and how we understand them has changed with each generation. So I'm particularly interested in the intersections between the historical Jefferson, which is the one that historians are kind of bound to recover, and also the Jefferson of the American national ideology. Both of these have a history, and most of the book that I've written focuses on the former, so it's an attempt to recover the centrality of nationhood to Jefferson's thought. And it describes Jefferson's aspirations and claims about America and how these views shaped his politics and statecraft in ways that the scholarship has often, I suggest, misunderstood. But the book also wants to make clear that Jefferson assumed that the only way the nation would live forever, and he did tell one correspondent that nations never die, that they are, in fact, sociological entities moving through time with a past, a present, and a future. And the only way the nation will live forever is if nation future will continually remember nation past and act in such a way that would provide a kind of continuity between the one and the other. And he understood that the future would be different from the past in fundamental ways. He couldn't have imagined the world that we live in today, and he understood that it would be incumbent upon citizens in the future to exercise a judgment necessary to reimagine and recover and reconceptualize and renegotiate the past in ways that would make it relevant to the present. So I actually think that Jefferson's own project of nation-making envisioned this collective reworking of national practice and meaning in ways that make many historians uncomfortable. So for example, claims about a contemporary public policy being Jeffersonian, sometimes drive historians crazy, since he couldn't have imagined the 20th century welfare state, for example. So we tend to think that not much of what he said applies in any kind of direct sense to our current predicaments or condition. But I think that in a way Jefferson authorized, if that's the right word, these kinds of collective reimaginings of the national meaning. Or as he put it to one correspondent in 1810, our children will be as wise as we are, and will establish in the fullness of time those things not yet ripe for establishment. So be it. And so this is one reason I think why that meaning is in continual contestation, meaning of the nation, and is in a continual process of definition. And so that process will go on, I think, as long as there's the United States of America, and as long as there's the United States of America, I think we'll have to continue to talk about Jefferson, which is why one reason I'm particularly interested in him. So this, if you think about it, is actually an expression of profound trust in posterity. And all of this is connected to the remarks I want to make about Jefferson and religion now. So you may have seen, I saw about a month ago in The Guardian a description of a recent poll that was taken in the United States. And the findings were that up to 25% of Americans thought that President Obama, may in fact be the Antichrist. And so 13% knew he was the Antichrist. And there was another, 12 to 13% that wasn't quite sure. He might be, but they weren't sure. So I find that troubling and very interesting in lots of ways. But you might or might not know that that during the election of 1800, the presidential election, that Jefferson himself faced these kinds of accusations as well. And I'll just give you some representative samplings of the Federalist opposition writing about him. Timothy Dwight, who was a minister in New England, preached a sermon that said if the Republicans, that's Jefferson's party, not the current Republican Party. It's very complicated. The current the current Democratic Party is sort of the heir of Jefferson's Republican Party, so that makes things really complex. But anyway, Timothy Dwight said that if the Republicans won, we may behold a strumpet personating a goddess on the altar of Jehovah. The Bible, he said, would be cast into a bonfire, the vessels of the sacramental supper borne by an ass in public procession, and our children, either wheedled or terrified, uniting in chanting mockeries against God. We may even see our wives and daughters victims of illegal prostitution. So Dwight was connecting, Jefferson's republicanism with what had happened in France, the fears of the French Revolution. Very concerned about Republicans dismissing religion as a kind of, sort of established religion as a kind of bulwark of order in society. There were quite a number of other, there's some interesting stories that I think are some of them may be apocryphal. There's a story of a woman who, in Massachusetts, who went to the only Republican in town and brought her Bible and handed it to him and said, this is the only place I know that this thing will be safe if Jefferson wins, because no one will suspect, a Bible in the home of a Republican, So anyway, that's all very interesting. Another wrote, "We are not Frenchmen, and until the atheistical philosophy of a certain great Virginian shall become the fashion, which God of his mercy forbid, we never shall." So Federalists really felt like the people needed religion as a kind of instrument of order, and they felt like Jefferson's party was going to dismantle that. And Federalists then characterized the choice of the election of 1800 as one between, and this comes from a Federalist paper, one between allegiance to God and a religious president, or on the one hand, or Jefferson and no God. Right? So Jefferson faces the same kinds of accusation and criticism that we see today. As well. So the question is, why do they think this way about Jefferson? What exactly is it that, do they have some sort of evidence or proof for this? And I think there are several things that people pointed to at the time. and that we can look at today. And one is Jefferson's advocacy of disestablishment of religion, separation of church and state. On Jefferson's tombstone, of course, one of the three things he wants to most be remembered for is as the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which essentially declared that civil rights have no dependence on our opinions in religious matters, any more than our opinions, he said, in physics and geometry, ought to determine whether or not we can vote or run for public office. And so, that's one thing, this advocacy of disestablishment and of separation of church and state, which you may have heard of. He coins this phrase, the wall of separation between church and state. Also, there was some apparent indifference that he seemed to indicate about religion and religious matters. In his Notes on the State of Virginia, which is sort of the only book he published in his lifetime, when he's describing kind of his advocacy of disestablishment, he has this kind of offhand comment, which is very nice in a way, but it got him into lots of trouble, where he said, essentially, if my neighbor believes there are 20 gods or no God, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. So he was trying to say that differences in religious opinion shouldn't impact our civil rights, but that seemed to be a little bit flippant, right? A little indifferent to religious views. And so people, when they got a hold of Federalists, when they got a hold of that, had a field day with it and made lots of it. But I think what I want to do today is just suggest that there are some complications with this view, and I want to say a few things about how indifferent Jefferson actually was, and there are some things about Jefferson that really do undermine, I think, this picture. One is that Jefferson's public bills, like the Statute for Religious Freedom, for example, or his letter to the Danbury Baptists, were not, in their substance, anti-religious at all. In fact, his bill for religious freedom begins with the phrase, "Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free." So he sort of begins with a kind of religious premise that the Creator had created freedom of conscience, and that we ought to enact that essentially in public policy. And essentially everything else follows from those premises. The letter to the Danbury Baptists also, says that he will pray to the common Father and Creator of man for his protection and blessing. So he's not at all, and this is while he's president, so he's not at all hostile to kind of using that sort of religious language and religious rhetoric. But I think what I want to focus on today is what Jefferson actually advocates and what his actual religious views are, not so much his advocacy of freedom of conscience, but where he thinks freedom of conscience ought to lead. And Jefferson was essentially, I think maybe the best way to describe him is that he was a kind of primitive Christian. And that, in other words, Jefferson's ultimate goal was to protect the integrity of religion itself, the true faith. And and in fact, at one point he told a correspondent, "I am a true Christian." And the problem is, of course, that what Jefferson means by true Christian is not what most evangelicals of his day thought or believed Christianity involved. And so he wants to protect true Christianity from all sorts of corruptions he believed had leaked in. So he says, and I think this is very interesting to me, that his goal was almost in a way, it seems, to kind of evangelize for this primitive Christianity. Jesus' character and teaching, he said to Benjamin Rush, suffered from priestcraft, the mystifications and Platonisms that had accrued over time had really distorted and distracted people from what he believed Jesus' real teaching was. And so his goal in that sense was to kind of protect the teachings and reputation of Jesus. And you may have heard of the Jefferson Bible. I'm sure many people have, and I have a copy of it here. I was going to pass it around. I don't know if I should now, but it's you know, he does this, it's very interesting, he does this after the election of 1800, after he's received all this, you know, barrage of criticism for being an atheist in religion. And I mean, it's clear he wasn't an atheist, but he sits down and starts thinking very carefully about his religious views. I don't know how he had time to do this while he was president, but he took 4 copies of the Gospels, and one in Greek, one in Latin, one in French, and one in English. And he took out his scissors, and he started reading through them and started clipping the passages that he felt were, you know, the true words and true sayings of Jesus, and he pasted them in a new book, right? And he told one correspondent, when he kept this private, right? So it's not like he was sharing this with people. And when people did find out about it later after his death, they went crazy. Let me see if I can find this great. I don't know if I can. This interesting line about how, I mean, you know, is this the man that we want to replace George Washington as president? Anyway, oh yeah, this is it. Here, listen to this. I think you'll like this. So this guy's reading later after Jefferson's death, and he says, you know, we look in vain in Jefferson's character for those enlarged views, that stern integrity, that high sense of honor which should characterize the successor of Washington. What shall we say of him as a subject of the moral government of Jehovah? Think of his spending the last years of his advanced age in preparing his atheistical works for the press, and the last moments of his life in charging his grandson to publish them to the world, and such blasphemies too as the world has never heard, and such as it would be the height of impiety to repeat. So people didn't appreciate this. In other words, they've generally looked at this project as a slight, you know, to Christianity, a slight to religion. Jefferson was thinking about it differently. I think that he was thinking about this as a kind of distillation of the pure teachings of Christ. And this was a book that he actually used for his personal devotion, which I find interesting as well. But he said to another correspondent, and many people, he said essentially it's pretty easy, you know, to differentiate the true teachings of Jesus from all the stuff that the disciples and other writers had thrown in. I mean, he said it's like pulling diamonds out of a dunghill. You know, it's fairly straightforward. It didn't really take me very long. And you know, there are a lot of verses missing. Like if you pull out your regular New Testament, like we moved from verse 31 of one chapter immediately into verse 12 of the next chapter. So there's a lot pulled out. All the miracles are gone. The resurrection is gone. Anything about the virgin birth is gone. And you're left with a sort of ethical, you know, a set of ethical or moral teachings. And Jefferson felt like that this was, you know, he had captured it at this point. He said essentially that you know, he said priestcraft had induced the unthinking part of mankind to throw off the whole system in disgust and to pass sentence as an impostor on the most innocent, the most eloquent, and the most sublime character that has ever been exhibited to man. He wrote this letter to John Adams. I think is very interesting. I think it's a pretty good description of the way he thinks about Christianity. The Christian priesthood, finding the doctrines of Christ leveled to every understanding and too plain to need explanation, saw in the mysticisms of Plato materials with which they might build up an artificial system which might from its indistinctness admit everlasting controversy, give employment for their order, and introduce it to profit, power, and preeminence. The doctrines which flowed from the lips of Jesus himself are within the comprehension of a child. But thousands of volumes have not yet explained the Platonisms engrafted on them, and for this obvious reason, that nonsense can never be explained. Their purposes, however, are answered. Plato is canonized, and it is now deemed as impious to question his merits as those of an apostle of Jesus. He is peculiarly appealed to as an advocate of the immortality of the soul, and yet I will venture to say that were there no better arguments than his in proof of it, not a man in the world would believe it. So I think that's a pretty nice description of the way Jefferson thinks about the teachings of Jesus. And he says to another that when they're divested of the rags in which the clergy have enveloped them and brought to the original purity and simplicity of the benevolent institutor, it becomes a religion of all others most friendly to liberty and science and the freest expansion of the human mind. So this is a religion that's not at all hostile to progress in science at all, but in fact the opposite. So the point, I guess, here is that Jefferson essentially thinks that the disestablishment of religion and the establishment of freedom of conscience will offer us the freedom to pursue truth. And that this would return all Americans. Now, I mean, this is what I think is interesting. Jefferson is not really like a modern pluralist in the way that we think. He felt like that freeing us up to pursue the truth would actually lead us all in the same direction in the end, and that would return all Americans essentially to devotion to Jesus. And here is Jefferson, again, in a very interesting statement from 1822. Had the doctrines of Jesus been preached always as pure as they came from his lips, the whole civilized world would now have been Christian. So he assumes that if the pure teachings of Jesus are preserved, then everyone will essentially assent to them. And his definition of belief was the assent of the mind to an intelligible proposition, which I find an interesting definition of faith. He said that essentially faith is involuntary. It's not something that we essentially have much control over at all, which is why he found the doctrine of Calvinism particularly troubling. He said that if we don't have any control over our faith, and I guess the Calvinist would say, yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, that means you're not one of the elect, essentially, right? Because you haven't been given the grace to believe things that your understanding can't necessarily comprehend. And so this is what Jefferson would have a terrible problem with. In fact, he said that Calvinism was demonism. He told Adams that Calvin was the Antichrist, or worthy of an insane asylum. He said the only way to deal with Calvinists is like to put them in straitjackets, which is this is very private correspondence, but it's a very interesting thing to say. So here's where Jefferson expects us to end up. He fully expected Americans to to become not anti-religious or hostile to religion, but in fact the most devoted followers of the primitive Jesus, the primitive teachings of Christ. I rejoice, he said in 1822, that in this blessed country of free inquiry and belief, which has surrendered its creed and conscience to neither kings nor priests, the genuine doctrine of one only God, as opposed to Trinitarian conception of God, is reviving. And I trust that there is not a young man now living in the United States who will not die a Unitarian. Now, if you know anything about the United States, you understand that he was wrong in that prediction. That's one of the worst predictions in all of American history. In fact, when Americans followed their consciences, they tended more often than not to become born-again evangelicals. And this was true even of many of Jefferson's own grandchildren. And it's fascinating that he's writing this in the midst of the greatest proliferation of evangelical revivalism probably in the history of the world, referred to often as the Second Great Awakening. So that's a very interesting irony, I think. So actually, and I should say too, and this is a point that's worth recalling, that Jefferson's greatest political supporters tended to be these religious dissenters, Baptists and Methodists, some Catholics as well, and Jews. There was one veteran of the American Revolution. He said, I'm a Republican. I'm Jewish, and therefore I'm a Republican. In Europe, in monarchies, Jews are hunted all over the earth, but he said, here we have rights. And so, as I said, his greatest supporters were Baptists and Methodists who really appreciated Jefferson's exaltation of freedom of conscience and really practiced a kind of Jeffersonian democratic style of Christianity, which emphasized the freedom of the individual conscience. Which led, of course, to a kind of cacophony of religious sects, and what Jefferson did not imagine would happen. He essentially thought we would all kind of come to become Unitarians, and this, of course, didn't happen. So, Jefferson, I guess, I guess what I'm after here is to suggest that Jefferson was not really a modern, pluralist, I guess, in the sense that he thinks everyone's opinion is as good as anyone else's. That's not a great definition of pluralism, but that's more of what I mean. But rather, he thought that dismantling artificial barriers to thought would free people up to pursue truth, and that everyone would essentially arrive at the same place, which for him was unitary and rational Christianity. And my argument here today, or suggestion I should say, is that there's a kind of precise analogy here with his views of political opinion. Jefferson quite often used religious language to talk about politics, and his political opponents, the Federalists in particular, he often called them heretics or blasphemers, which is very interesting. And people have suggested that Jefferson cared about politics and he was sort of indifferent to religion, and I don't think that's quite right, but he certainly had a sense that that people, if they were sort of freed up from the distortions of people invested in a particular point of view, they would essentially end up with the truth. So what's unique is that Jefferson really does care about religion in a certain kind of conformity, but only after the sort of unhindered arrival at truth. There's no coercion involved. You can't force people to believe anything. And it kind of drove him crazy, that what resulted from his freedom of conscience was the evangelical revivals in the Second Great Awakening. I mean, he did reflect on this a little bit about these revivals and thought they were a little bit problematic. He described them as fanaticism. In fact, he described one of these revivals in Richmond, where the women, he said, attended by their priests, sometimes by a hen-pecked husband, they pour forth the effusions of their love to Jesus in terms as amatory and carnal as their modesty would permit them to use to a mere earthly lover. So he wasn't very crazy about revivals, but eventually what I find interesting is that these heirs of Jefferson's disestablishment of religion eventually go on essentially to repudiate his vision of a rational Christianity, but also for some people anyway, and you can imagine just thinking about this in the 20th and 21st centuries, also even his way of thinking about religious freedom in relation to the state. And in fact, the recent controversy of the Texas education, school board or whatever, which got rid of Jefferson in the world history curriculum, at least temporarily, replacing him with Aquinas and Calvin, precisely because they found his endorsement of the separation of church and state troubling. And so this is coming kind of full circle, and I find it profoundly ironic. But what I think is very interesting is that many of these sort of European philosophes were actually, some of them anyway, personally pious, but most of them thought religion was necessary for social order and civil peace. And Edward Gibbon described Roman religion kind of in this way. He said the people believed, the philosophers rejected, but the rulers knew it was useful. It's kind of like Voltaire, who was a notorious unbeliever, but he felt like religion was really good for the masses, so they wouldn't steal his spoons, and good for his wife, so she wouldn't cheat on him. But so they kind of advocate a two-tiered religious system with kind of a pure, simple, rational religion for the elite and a melodramatic faith to regulate the minds and hearts of the masses. And I find this interesting because this really is not Jefferson's approach. It's not really Jefferson's position at all. I mean, he simply believed that Americans were capable of arriving at Unitarianism, essentially by the light of their own unhindered moral sense and reason. And so Jefferson's faith was democratic, I think in profound ways. And the point here is that Jefferson is not indifferent to where people end up. In other words, it's not that he doesn't care what people believe. He thinks that they should have the right to follow their consciences, but he assumes that they will end up with his enlightened Christianity. And he believed that free inquiry is not going to lead to anarchy because he knows that I think this is rooted in his profound trust of the American public, which I was trying to talk about a little bit earlier in terms of politics. He simply believes that Americans are capable of assenting to truth. And I think this has a kind of, I just wanted to mention this too, that it has a kind of precise analogy in politics. His attitude toward Hamiltonian finance and Federalist politics offers a kind of analog here. approach toward Orthodox institutional Christianity and the priesthood. Hamilton, he believes, complicating matters, and which should or could be simple enough for the common laborer to understand, just as the pure teachings of Jesus were accessible to a little child prior to the Platonizing of the priests, who corrupted and confused in order to secure their own power and authority. Hamiltonian Finance, he believed, tended to enrich a very small group of investors in public securities and tune the government's ear exclusively to their interests, while rendering the average American both less economically autonomous and less able to impact public policy. And so Jefferson's solution in both areas was the spread of information, free inquiry, and reason. His assumed outcome in both areas was truth. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of Richard Rorty's line, you know, take care of freedom, and the truth will take care of itself. So the point here is that, that you know, freeing people up to pursue the truth doesn't lead us to anarchy. One other thing, these thoughts are a little bit disconnected, but I think it's worth noting that, you know, in support of this argument, that in Jefferson's Bill for Religious Freedom, he says, you know, I mentioned this earlier, that our civil rights and capacities ought not to be dependent on our opinions in religious matters any more than they ought to be dependent on our views about physics and geometry. But if you think about it or follow this analogy, I mean, of course, Jefferson does think there's a truth about physics, right? And you know, his point is that you're free, essentially, to follow and to embrace an Aristotelian conception of the universe, but you would be wrong, right? And in fact, you would be subject to the ridicule of the community, and you know, kind of become the laughingstock of the public in light of their own, you know, pursuit of reason and free inquiry. So, so Jefferson, you know, this is essentially exactly why he hopes that all Americans are going to become Unitarians. Of course, the thing is, you know, all these ironies about Jefferson going in this other, very different direction from where the majority of Americans go. You know, in his own program, there are no tools available to kind of persuade people who are not open to kind of his rationalizing Christianity. So his prescriptions for religious freedom kind of backfire in a way in that regard. And I want to just finish like with a couple of questions for you, maybe you can help me with. And I just wonder, like, if you think that this kind of religious pluralism that Jefferson advocates necessarily leads, or you know, this freedom of inquiry and apparent indifference that some people thought he demonstrated about religion leads necessarily to secularism itself. I mean, does it dilute and water down, you know, Orthodox belief systems? The way he described things at the University of Virginia, he said, if you bring all these sects together and mix them up, we'll soften their asperities, liberalize and neutralize their prejudices, and make the general religion a religion of peace, reason, and morality. Of course, what actually happens is a greater proliferation of religious sects, of evangelical sects. And then also, I'm interested in, you know, trying to understand whether Jefferson's claim to be a true Christian, you know, is warranted. You know, and I find his definition of belief very interesting to contrast with, you know, like William James's argument that that belief is, you know, faith is belief in something concerning which doubt is still theoretically possible. So it's the willingness to act in a cause, the prosperous issue of which is not certified to us in advance. And so this is very different from Jefferson's argument that belief is the assent of the mind. It's basically involuntary. And I wonder if there's any allowance at all for uncertainty in Jefferson. There actually is some, and he talks about resting his head on the pillow of ignorance often in his correspondence with John Adams about matters that we can't possibly comprehend or understand. But anyway, so Jefferson's wrong about the direction that's going to happen, you know, the Americans are going to take. But I will say that you know, evangelicals are his heirs, as are all who benefit from American religious freedom. And Tocqueville, I think, maybe noticed this as well as anyone ever has, that, you know, Americans, why were Americans so religious? He said it's precisely because of the separation of church and state. Americans are free to be revolutionary and democratic in their politics and religious at the same time, whereas Europeans, when they attacked monarchy and state institutions, had of necessity to attack the church as well. Okay, so that's all I have for my talk, and I'm very interested to hear your comments and questions. Thanks.
I just had a question.
Yeah.
You know, Jefferson was an obsessive record keeper about the botany in his garden, and obviously a big naturalist, spending all kinds of money to bring back things, samples from the West and all this. You know, so these scientific type inquiries at the time, how much did that perhaps feed into this suspicion of him as an atheist and all that kind of stuff?
You mean so
the amount of time he spent on these kind of activities and the energy he spent on those kind of activities, you know.
That's yeah, absolutely. That really is a. I mean, the Federalists talk about this all the time in their literature. You know, there's this guy. He's just his contemplation of. I mean, they describe him as a sort of kind of funny because he hated metaphysics, but they just sort of described him as a metaphysician sitting on top of Monticello, you know, contemplating, you know, bones, for example. I mean, which is not metaphysical, but anyway, the point is, yes. I mean, that is part of like the image of Jefferson in his time, and people find that problematic. Although I'd say that most people, you know, in his day didn't really see a conflict of necessity between the pursuit of, you know, science and religious belief at all, and he himself, I find very interesting, actually kind of describes, at least at one point, a position that sounds very much like, you know, intelligent design. I mean, essentially, I think he would kind of adhere to that kind of view in his time, you know. But this is, of course, pre-Darwin. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but it does play a role in the public perception of Jefferson. But I don't know that it's about. I don't know that it necessarily leads to the idea that Jefferson is hostile to religion because he's a man of science. Yeah, Pam, go ahead.
Well, I think Jefferson's religion was Jefferson, for one thing.
Well, he said, I'm a sect by myself.
He is definitely,
yeah.
He is his own God, I think. He is, and definitely intellectual elitism. And given that, he has disdain for his critics. Is there any intellect of any contemporary intellectual whom he admired, who disagreed with,
Well,
who gave him one for his money?
I don't think. I almost think I don't think he was disdainful. I mean, he didn't like where a lot of Americans ended up. He didn't. But his attitude wasn't one of disdain. I think, in fact, the opposite. It's like profoundly capacious and democratic, you know, because he's essentially saying, unlike Voltaire, who thinks, yeah, you people out there, you better believe.
Well, I don't want to get hung up on this.
Okay.
I'm really interested in who of his contemporaries who disagreed with him did he profoundly respect. If we can't think of one, then I think that answers the question.
Well, no, I mean, he respected, well, he and Adams, for example, is a good example. I mean, they did have a sort of breakup for about 12 years where they didn't talk to each other. But they disagreed on a number of things, but they certainly had profound respect and even love for one another, you know, by the end of their lives. And he certainly often said things like, you know, I mean, he consistently would say, I can disagree with your views, but still appreciate you as a person, and we can be friends, right? I think he was most hostile to people like Hamilton, who he believed were actually leading, you know, the country in a direction that was deeply troubling, cynical, and problematic, you know, from his perspective. So, I guess I don't. I mean, he had a pretty healthy correspondence with people that he didn't always agree with, even some Calvinists. That's Steve.
Yeah, I agree with you that his views were different from European thinkers of religion. Rousseau, for example, agreed with Jefferson's idea of the Bible as reason, or Christianity of reason and virtue, kind of distilling it down to that. Yet, in his most political writing, at the end of the social contract, he states that people must obey the state religion, so that we can trust them to obey the law. And during the English Civil War, there was all this fear that the English would join all these sects, and if they were going to their own churches where they couldn't be supervised, how can we trust them to obey the law? What are they be doing there? Talking about. You know, I'm wondering if Jefferson's view, different from those Europeans, has much to do with the American social and political context of the time. Because couldn't he trust your average American to have whatever religion they wanted, or no religion, because they weren't productive classes. They were slaves doing the work. And so one could trust Americans to have whatever religious belief they want or no religion, because they weren't going to make a revolution, because the people who were exploited, reproducing the wealth of the society, were slaves, and they didn't fit in probably to Jefferson's beliefs of religious tolerance.
I think I didn't understand where you were going with that, but yeah, I at the end I get it. I get exactly where you're headed, and I think that's kind of troubling, but it is a point that I find very compelling. That's all. I guess that's all. Yeah, Walter or whoever. Go ahead.
So I've got I guess a question for you, but also this pertains to your second question about is he a true Christian or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, it seems it's kind of anachronistic for me to say this about him, but it seems like he's one of those guys who's interested in the historical Jesus. You know, trying to cut out everything that's supernatural and just finding, you know, what is those primitive teachings that he has. And I mean, it's always seemed to me, if you throw out the resurrection, the miracles, the birth of, you know, the miraculous virgin birth, I mean, what is there to separate those primitive teachings from Judaism? I mean, did he understand that, you know, Jesus as a Jewish, you know, thinker, like re-articulating those ideas that are in the Torah and everything else? And so, like, how does that then impact him in terms of thinking of himself as a Christian versus thinking about him as, you know, a practitioner of, say, the Jewish faith?
That's an interesting question. One of the things, in fact, I'm envisioning, if I do, you know, pursue this project, a chapter that deals at least in part substantially with this very question of Jefferson's approach to Judaism. He thought Jesus was a reformer of Judaism, and that he actually says some pretty unflattering things about Judaism. I'm trying to find his syllabus here of the teachings of Jesus, because he essentially thinks that the Jews had a pretty he said that their system was deism, but their conception of God was degrading and injurious. You know, this is kind of a capricious God of the Old Testament, which he found problematic, and he thought that Jesus came to reform these Jews, this Jewish religion, these views, I should say. He thinks that he thinks that there's a profound kind of separation at that point. Jesus' reformations of these earlier Jewish teachings, it turns us in a completely new direction. I mean, I don't think he would recognize himself as following Judaism, but does that answer the question? The wife is voting?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, I perhaps there's a little connection with what the gentleman there was saying that I want to ask. Since its inception, there have been many interpretations of Christianity that don't view it as a fundamentally ethical system or a system of ethics. And you can trace this back to Jesus himself if you want, or you can trace it primarily to the man we call the Apostle Paul, for example. And I think in these contexts, it's much more about a human alienation of himself, a person's alienation of himself, of others, and of God. So there is even like evidence in the New Testament of putting limits on human conscience, what the conscience of humans is able to do. Is there any evidence that Jefferson grappled with this issue, or was he sort of completely sold on sort of the ultimate capability of human conscience to actually find out meaning and
Great question. I can answer it in part by a Jefferson quote. I have sworn eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. You know, he doesn't see. I don't think his reputation, of course, is that he was this kind of eternal optimist about progress. I mean, I think that's limited in profound ways by his nationalism and his conception of history. But you know, just in answer to your question, he was much more sanguine about human beings, you know, arriving at, you know, some kind of truth. And but on the other hand, there were things like that he said we can't possibly comprehend. So people would write to him about, like, and ask him a question about the afterlife or the world of the spirits or whatever, and he would say, well, that's just something that God made our minds in a particular way. We can't understand those things, and so God must not have intended for us to know about them or understand them. And so that's where he says, I rest my head on this pillow of ignorance. And so he does, like, there are a number of things, and he's complicated. Like he says he's a materialist, that he can't comprehend how. I mean, he says essentially to talk of you know, spirits, things that are not material, is to talk of nothings. But at the same time, he does believe pretty clearly in the afterlife. Which is, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe that's easy for somebody to reconcile, but it's a conundrum in a way, it seems to me. But again, I'm not answering these questions, but exactly, I'm just thinking aloud. But he does, yeah, yes. Like, there are things that, like, human mind, I guess, at this point simply can't comprehend. And he, I think, would have agreed with Adams, who wrote to him. And one of the things, you know, one of the most important things that the human mind couldn't comprehend is, you know, the Trinity, like that 3 is 1 and 1 is 3. God couldn't possibly want us to believe that as a kind of something that was efficacious for our salvation, because the human mind simply can't assent to it. And like John Adams wrote this very interesting letter to him where he said, you know, if we were at Mount Sinai and there was fire and brimstone, and, you know, he describes his earthquakes, and he said we might have been petrified with fear and terror and nearly died of fright, but he said we could not, you know, if God said 3 is 1 and 1 is 3, we might have submitted to it, but we couldn't believe it. It's impossible for the human mind to believe that. So I guess, yeah, I do think I see some areas of human limitation. His reputation is different. Rebecca?
So what did Jefferson think about Milton? Because Milton had exactly the same idea, that there should be religious freedom because everyone would, if they were free to think, would arrive at Milton's truth. I mean, and the truth about God.
Right. Well, he mostly, I mean, he certainly read Milton on this issue, but he recommended his poetry. But I think he's more, his more immediate inspiration, I think, would be Locke, who he took extensive notes on Locke and Shaftesbury, for example, not on Milton. But that's another non-answer.
The same exact idea, but the different truths that they were going to arrive at.
Exactly. Yeah. Right, and so how does Jefferson explain that to himself? Right? The same way he explains why some people might vote for Federalists. That they're closet monarchists, that they are actually, not real Americans, they're Anglo-men, or that they've been temporarily blinded and duped by, Federalist propaganda. And, that's one of his answers, I think, to it. Danny, and then Bob.
This is a sort of extension of Rebecca's question. I mean, Unitarians don't have a monopoly on reason, right? And there are people like Milton and the Puritans who said the same thing, that if we just think rationally and sort of look at the world around us, we'll arrive at this truth. And I have a friend who teaches at a Catholic university where he has to sign a statement that doesn't say he believes in the truth of Catholicism, but that he believes in reason. And everybody that teaches there has to say they believe in reason, because the university has this confidence that if they teach the students reason, that they'll arrive at Catholic truth. And so, I guess, and to me that doesn't seem strange. I mean, I would think that if you are a believer, it's very natural that you would think that the evidence of science and reason will eventually lead people to see things your way. So, I guess I'm wondering why we should even be surprised that Jefferson, on the one hand, believed in sort of freedom of conscience and inquiry, and on the other hand, believed in this sort of particular religious truth. I would think a lot of religious believers would sort of fit into that. I mean, would have both of those beliefs, and why should it surprise us?
Well, I agree with you. I don't know. I think the reason that it's even an interesting line of inquiry is because so many people do find it surprising. Right? I mean, I think I think it has a lot to do with Jefferson's sort of iconic stature in our public mythology. I'm just kind of riffing here, but I think so that a couple of years ago there was a billboard. It was put up by the Atheist Society of California or something. And they had some quote from Jefferson. The atheists want him to be an atheist. They had to take the billboard down because it was a spurious quotation, but and then a lot of evangelicals want him to be a real evangelical Christian. So this guy David Barton, you guys remember? Yeah. He wrote a book about a year ago that made a big splash. The guy was on Jon Stewart and that kind of thing. I mean, I don't know what you have to do to get on Jon Stewart, but David Barton got on there and he was essentially saying, I mean, look, Jefferson said he was a true Christian, right? I mean, he kind of wants Jefferson to be an evangelical, right? So, I mean, one of the interesting things to me about this whole issue is like the historical Jefferson versus the Jefferson that has been corrupted by all these additions, right? So, I think there's a very interesting intersection between those things. But anyway, short answer is you're right. I don't think that we necessarily should be surprised. Oh, Bob, sorry.
Yeah, so we know Jefferson had the largest private library, or one of the largest in the United States at the time. What's in there that informs what he thinks about religion? It seems like to me, I remember there's some books in there on Islam, for example.
Yeah, could he be Muslim?
Could he be Muslim?
Yeah, I mean, he's not Jewish, but he's not super big on Christ's miracles, so maybe he's Muslim.
No, he's not. He said that he said at one point, I can't find it. Being a Calvinist, you might as well be a Mohammedan. He said. So that's not a very flattering depiction of either. But I think he did own a copy of the Quran. I don't know how extensively he looked through it, but I mean. I don't know, Bob. I haven't done like that a thorough inventory. That's something. That's a place I would want to go. But he certainly took extensive notes on, like I said, Locke and Shaftesbury and Bolingbroke and others. A lot of people that he read early on were in fact these kind of Enlightenment philosophical skeptics. Kind of like Bolingbroke. Real critics of religion. And I just find interesting that Jefferson comes to a place where. He's not disdainful, of religion, but develops a kind of sect, you know, that is satisfying to his own sort of spiritual quest.
And didn't he establish a religion department at Virginia when? Well,
No, the opposite is true, right? That you establish UVA and you don't want to have a department of theology. In fact, he got in a lot of trouble for this because most universities of the day were kind of founded by religious sects, and the design was to, you know, inculcate religion and also create ministers for the denomination. And he wanted this to be a secular university, and he got a lot of flack for it. He hired Thomas Cooper to teach in his, you know, in the sciences, and but he had to end up letting him go because there was so much critique by Presbyterians. He hated Presbyterians, and because they were. Eventually, he said, "Okay, here's what we'll do. We'll let all the different religious denominations kind of establish on the outskirts of the university their own little seminaries, and the students can attend those and come back and forth." And the idea, you know, his idea was, I mean, his idea was that if all these sects are, you know, thriving together, then no one will sort of dominate the whole conversation, and that it'll soften everyone's view, and will wipe away a lot of these corruptions, and maybe it'll distill itself down into the, you know, the actual essence. So he didn't necessarily feel threatened by this proliferation of sects. Maybe he just had a kind of longer-term view of what was going to take place, but he did get, and people thought he was very disdainful of religion for not setting up a school of theology there. Yeah, Glenn, sorry.
I guess this is a two-part question. One, sorry, Brian.
Yeah, I'll try to keep that in my head all at once.
If the Federalists thought that Jefferson was satanic and perhaps the Antichrist, what was their opinion of the third alternative, Aaron Burr?
Well, I mean, I guess what's telling there is that they did eventually go ahead and vote for Jefferson in that, you know, hung election of 1800.
And on a more serious note, where was the role of faith in Jefferson's conception of religion? It seems to me that in some ways Pam's remark that Jefferson was his own God seems to have some relevance. It seems that Jefferson is engaged in a project of subordinating religion to reason in the same way that he's subordinating nature to reasonable or rational inquiry, in the same way that he's subordinating politics to reason. What did he say about faith, which is, I guess, the taking that leap of the inexplicable, accepting something that's absolutely non-rational or irrational, such as a miracle?
Yeah, that's what I think. There doesn't seem to be much place for that kind of leap in Jefferson's thought. You know, again, his definition of belief was the assent of the mind to an intelligible proposition, and if your mind can't, you know, immediately assent to it, then it must not be something that your mind is created to assimilate. And that definition of faith, you know, that I read about, by William James, you know, this sort of power to trust, a power to risk a little beyond the available evidence, is not something that you really see in Jefferson. So he looks at, although, like I said, I mean, he writes these beautiful letters about about the afterlife, and he clearly has that kind of, you know, he embraces that view, and he says, like, well, Jesus tells us that God is a spirit, but he doesn't really define what a spirit is, and you know, he doesn't tell us that it's not material, you know, on some level, and he agrees with Locke's view that that it's almost, you know, blasphemous to say that the Creator can't endow matter with a mode of you know, of action called thinking. But I agree. I mean, like, this is what he does with the New Testament, right? He looks and he reads some miracle that doesn't make any sense to him at all, and he just cut that part out. Actually, he cut the good parts out and pasted them in a book, and all the bad parts are left in the old Bibles. Anyway, yes.
In the last minute or so before you opened the floor to questions, you likened this assent to the mind. The assent of the mind to an involuntary act. Right.
Intelligible proposition.
Right, and then you said this is involuntary.
He did say that.
He said that, or you are saying that?
He said that his view was, he was writing to another friend of his, and he said that his view was the opposite of Calvinism, which is that we are saved by our works, which are within our power, but that rather than by our faith, which is not.
I am a little troubled by the idea of, I mean, to ascend something, right? To ascend.
Assent.
Assent.
Approve of, like, just.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh yes, this is true.
Okay.
Right. Like I can't. I don't have any choice in the matter. 1 + 1 is 2. 1 plus.
You got that right.
It's been a long time, since I've done math. Is there another hand? Yeah, Colin.
I was struck by the paradox where, he wants to get rid of the state religion, and what happens instead is that there's an explosion of religious activity, and so your argument is that he was wrong. But if you look at today's, the shift, increasing secularization of American society, in a sense they're adopting the European model, breaking away from the church, whatever the church may mean. So maybe he had it right after all.
Yeah, I think a long-term view.
Well, I think there's a kind of interesting irony in Jefferson's being opposed to evangelizing and the creation of all these new sects when he understood perfectly well that they were the greatest protector of religious freedom. The fact that there were so many of them and therefore there was no dominant one.
Yes. This is. What did you say? Did you say it's a paradox or a?
Well, it's an irony.
Yeah. It is because he definitely sort of just like Madison really thought that he said, he says a number of things that seem contradictory, right? Like he'll say, why should we have a uniformity of opinion? Any more than we ought to have a kind of uniformity in our looks. What if everyone's face looked exactly the same? That wouldn't be very interesting, would it? So why shouldn't we have a variety of views or a variety of opinions? And he certainly believed that. Sort of like Adam Smith, and others sort of believe that if you have a number of sects, that's actually a very good thing because, but of course, here's Adam Smith. What he says is that the teachers of each little sect, finding themselves almost alone, would be obliged to respect those of almost every other sect, and the concessions which they would mutually find it both convenient and agreeable to make to one another might, in time, probably reduce the doctrine of the greater part of them to that pure and rational religion, free from every mixture of absurdity, imposture, or fanaticism. So, over time, maybe the whole idea of this, temporary pluralism is that it protects us from the kind of religious destruction that you'd see, religious wars that you'd seen in Europe. And he says that the freedom of conscience will, basically protect us from those kinds of crusades. And maybe the idea is that over time they'll all distill into this pure. So maybe it's a kind of longer term view. I don't know if that's a good answer, but.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.